Good morning or good afternoon, depending on what time zone you're in. My name is Sophia Kalantzakos, and I'm a professor at New York University and NYU Abu Dhabi in environmental studies and public policy. Here with me today is Chris Berry, who is the president of House Mountain Partners and an expert, and he joins me today to discuss the push to decarbonization that's already begun and the various materials that we need in order to affect this change. Now, Chris, thank you for being with us. We should be really excited about what's going on, correct? We should be excited because every country, every major country around the world has announced that they have plans to go carbon neutral by mid-century. Mm-hmm. And yet, we have a lot of trepidation and anxiety, at least I do. Sure. Some of the reasons are geopolitical, because we're seeing that the fraud geopolitics is also might be impacting this path to decarbonization. But also the geopolitics are impacting our access to resources. So we're seeing a race currently underway in order to gain access to the critical inputs, critical minerals that we're going to need in order to power this decarbonization effort. So what are your thoughts about that first thing? Should we be excited? Should we be nervous? What lies ahead? Give us an idea of some of the challenges.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you all of, I guess, the attendees, wherever you are in the world. I'm sitting here in Washington, D.C. this morning. Yeah, look, Sophia, to answer your question, I mean, I have focused on the geopolitical and really the economic issues around supply chain build out for critical minerals for about the last 10 years of my career. And it really has taken center stage, which is, you know, to your point, encouraging, and also I think should be approached with a little bit of trepidation. You know, the Paris Agreement, I think, to me, was really the tipping point around widespread acceptance and awareness that climate change is a threat, not just, you know, it is a geopolitical threat as well. And so it's gotten me thinking a lot over the last year or so about how we decarbonize, because I actually think there's a paradox embedded in this idea of green growth or decarbonization. I have spent most of my career focusing on the upstream portion of these supply chains. So what are the critical raw materials? Where are they going to come from? What do the costs look like? And of course, what are the environmental challenges? And I really think that, you know, my working thesis right now is called the paradox of green growth. And it's this idea that if we are going to lower, you know, the CO2, I guess, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, decarbonize transportation, decarbonize the electricity grid, it's not going to take less lithium or less cobalt or less copper. It's going to take more, much more in some instances. And of course, you know, hopefully we can deconstruct that over the next hour or so. But that is the challenge right now. And I think that's why, you know, when you talk about approaching this with some trepidation or some concern, how we balance the need for more raw materials while at the same time doing this within this new ESG framework is really the challenge going forward. You know,
you're setting the stage for multiple issues. Okay, so the first thing is, and that's just a question because we also have a lot of students who are following this webinar. And one of the things that I want to say is that, you know, that there's a huge focus on the energy transition. Mm-hmm. And this is actually, I mean, dealing with climate change is not only about the energy transition. Of course, it's about clean energy and, you know, the use of buildings, I mean, new technologies like renewables and the electrification of transport. And these seem to be at the center focus of what the world is trying to achieve. But I just don't want people to also lose sight that this is dealing with climate change is much more than that. So that it has to also do with building sustainability in throughout the economy and throughout the way of our life. And it's about energy efficiency, it's about new practices in agriculture, dealing with the environmental degradation and the such. But right now, the big conversation is about perhaps the launching of a new industrial policy. And one of the things that I want to mention is that for the first time after 4 years, the United States has returned to the climate table, and Joe Biden has announced a very ambitious industrial policy in order to lead the United States into this next phase, which is the phase that has to do with the energy transition. So my first question is there political consensus in the United States to do this? Is it feasible? And what about the fossil fuel industry?
Yeah, I would say, look, it's a very, again, sitting here in Washington, D.C., I sort of have a front row seat to everything political, but look, it's a very divided country, right? I mean, I think that the United States has really come, out of nowhere in the last 15 or 20 years to lead the world in terms of hydrocarbon production, of course, from fracking, which brings its own set of concerns and environmental concerns. And so, I think that any change away from sort of the status quo will probably happen, because I think what's happening is the economics around renewables, in particular electricity generation, and we can maybe go into some of that on the automotive side. The economics are continuing to improve and outcompeting, for example, coal-fired electricity generation. Every quarter, every year, they're getting a little bit better and better, to the point where I believe might have been earlier this week or late last week, Next Era Energy, which is a coal producer here in the United States, their CEO went on record and said that he didn't think that there was a single coal-fired power plant in the United States today that was economic. And so for somebody in that position to make that kind of a statement, I think is a very powerful sign of the winds of change. I just think that, the business and the technology is moving a lot faster than the politics. And that's a real challenge.
Okay, so that's an interesting point. But, America is not the world. It's true that in America, and Americans want to believe that the world cannot do without them. And they only have two settings. One is to lead and one is to withdraw. So in the interim of those 4 years where the US was the advocate of climate denial and withdrawing from the Paris Agreement and other international multilateral institutions, what have others been up to? I mean, Europe has been very consistent. And what about China? I mean, the geopolitics are so fraught right now that we keep forgetting that China has made tremendous inroads. Not only have they announced a new ambition to be carbon neutral by 2060, but they've also been really working to make this transition, the energy transition, the electrification through renewables or the electrification of transport, a reality. So give us a little bit of information about where these two major actors are.
Sure. Well, I think that, look, how to address this? Well, maybe starting off with China. I think the real challenge between China and the United States, which, this kind of tension between the two countries, I don't necessarily think is going to abate or lessen at all with the Biden administration. Arguably, it's going to intensify because of these technology and these geopolitical issues that you mentioned. But, what China is doing right now is reconsolidating all of their critical minerals industries, okay? And one very interesting example is, of course, with rare earth elements. There's the group in China that controls how these supply chains are essentially built out. It's called the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology. You'll hear it referred to as the MIIT. The rare earth industry, just for those of you on the call that aren't aware, China controls around 80% of the entire rare earth element industry, okay? From mining to refining to magnet production. And many of the rare earth elements you may have heard of, neodymium or praseodymium, are crucial in next generation technologies, in particular in electric vehicle motors. And so Groups like the MIIT are working to standardize control over China's domestic rare earth industry. So consolidate it and make it that much more powerful so they can control pricing, and also more importantly than that, I would argue, control imports and exports, and really use what they produce internally to build out their own next generation industries around renewables and around electric vehicles.
So in other words, they have a plan.
Yes.
And I'm going to stop right there, because we tend to say, oh, China, is trying to control these elements. But the reality is that, China has given the world some fair warning that these elements, and I think you have a slide to show that. But before we even show the slide, we're going to show a little bit of a map that shows, how the world is dependent on these different materials. Let's name a few of them, and then I'll go back to this idea about China. Let's pull up a map and show, first of all, name a few of these critical materials.
Sure.
And I'm going to put on my glasses because I can.
I know this chart that we're looking at here is sourced from the U.S. Geological Survey, and and again, I apologize, it is U.S. centric. But it's interesting in the sense that it shows you, so, the United States, one of the largest economies in the world, it shows you just how import dependent the United States is on critical minerals and materials. And Sophia, to answer your question specifically, cobalt, rare earth elements, lithium, and those are sort of the big three, I would say, that really pertain to decarbonization and batteries in particular. But what you're looking at here is a situation where the United States sources most of these materials from the countries that you see on the map, and of course China is the major producer and major consumer of a number of these critical materials. If you take cobalt as one example, the majority of cobalt that is produced, around 65 to 70% today, comes out of Central Africa in the Congo. You can see I've got the pointer right there. And what's interesting is China is actually responsible for about 80% of the global refining of cobalt. So one of the interesting things, and I have another slide that we can take a look at, is most of these critical minerals aren't rare. Okay, even though they're called rare earth elements, they're relatively abundant in the Earth's crust. I'll show a slide here in one moment. And what's interesting, though, is the actual downstream applications of refining this material into what's known as battery grade. Most of that takes place in China. So China really dominates the higher value portion of a lot of these supply chains. And that's the critical vulnerability, whether or not you're in the United States or in the Eurozone as well. And that's what we're just waking up to now.
So, this should have been a trade dispute, but as we saw from the crisis with rare earth minerals in 2010, China can use economic statecraft to leverage its position. But again, it's because I really much believe in frames. China is basically trying to add value to its economy, is it not? This is something that both the United States would like to do, and Europe is also trying to do. So
absolutely.
Why does it seem as if trade has gotten into this new realm of competition to the death?
Well, that's I think the Chinese, look, this is an economy that has really grown at, I think, 10% a year for decades, and is now starting to slow down a little bit, quite frankly. I think we can argue about the validity of Chinese growth statistics, but the risk with China, and this sort of delves into the economic realm where I'm not so much of an expert, but you could fall into a middle income trap where the country effectively becomes a producer of a specific good and an exporter, as opposed to focusing on domestic consumption. And when you think about some of the other things that the Chinese are trying to do, whether or not it's through Made in China 2025 or this dual circulation strategy, which essentially is designed to stimulate domestic consumption, what they're trying to do is consolidate these industries and focus more domestic than anything else. So, you mentioned earlier about the United States going sort of insular and inward over the last 4 years. I think one of the interesting things maybe to come out of this trade war is that you see China doing some of the similar types of things. And I'm not really sure what that means going forward for global trade, but I don't think it's particularly positive.
There's also, as we've noticed, there's a pushback. Of course, they say that as I heard a lecture a few years back, when we had some visitors at NYU Abu Dhabi, it was a Chinese delegation from the Academy of Social Sciences. And I asked the question of, but globalization is under threat. And the answer was, well, globalization is being questioned mostly by the Europeans and the Americans. The rest of the world really wants to develop. So there is, the reason I brought this up, because we do, both in the title of this webinar, but also there's this question of globalization being under threat. I mean, this competition for the energy transition, which is really a big, let's say it's not what we consider the fourth industrial revolution, but it is part of a new industrial revolution and a new way to regrow the economy, especially after COVID. I mean, there's competition because the major actors want to dominate in this space, and it's a completely legitimate issue. So we've seen that, it seems from the map that you showed us that companies and governments had relied for decades on free trade to have access to everything. And now with either globalization under threat and fraught economic relations, there's a push for regionalization and building independent and self-sufficient supply chains. Mm-hmm. We also see that the United States and Europe, frankly, are heavily dependent on getting these resources either from China or Russia. Australia is a separate case in itself. It seems to have like everything, but there are other issues there. But a lot of it from the developing world as well. So when we're talking, I mean, I know I kind of feel like I'm jumping from one thing to the next, but tell us a little bit about the supply chains. Let's take like lithium as an example. In order to transition to the electrification of transport, lithium is going to be a major component, lithium and cobalt. So mm-hmm. What's the story over there? I mean, do we have enough? Is the United States secure in having these supplies? And what about the price fluctuations? And what about this reconstitution of the supply chains?
Sure. Let me, I'm going to pull up another couple of slides here that I think really help to frame this out. Let me share this guy and then maximize it. This is an extremely busy slide, so I don't want to confuse anybody, but it really does, I think, hone in on your point and your question. What you're looking at here, again, is data from the U.S. Geological Service, excuse me. And what this shows us essentially is exactly how rare certain elements are, okay? And Sophia, to your point, if you look over here on the far left-hand corner, lithium is one of the most abundant elements in the Earth's crust, okay? So the issue is not, okay, can we find the lithium? Can we prospect for it? Can we develop resources? The issue is, can we produce battery quality material, battery quality lithium at scale? And that is really the race, and it's a high margin, a high value activity. And this is why companies like Tesla or BYD in China or VW with Northvolt in Europe are all racing to do this and all racing to lock up supply. And I'll just say one other thing as we're talking about lithium. Today, the lithium market is around 350,000 tons a year in size, okay? For the sake of perspective, copper is around 23 million tons. So lithium is very, very small, and it is critical in this battery business. Lithium, based on models that I've put together, lithium demand is going to triple to over 1 million tons by 2026 in 5 years. And then I think as battery prices continue to fall, I think lithium demand will double again to 2030. So you're going from around 350,000 tons a year today to roughly 2 million in the next 9 years. And this is a small market. Lithium resources are predominantly found in South America in an area called the Lithium Triangle, which is where Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia effectively converge. And then in Australia, which is where hard rock lithium is mined. And so you know, it's interesting because a lithium molecule, from the point time it's mined to the time it ends up in a battery in an electric vehicle, literally travels anywhere from 20 to 30,000 miles. It goes cross border, it goes back and forth, and it's because these supply chains are so diversified, for lack of a better phrase, that is going to change, okay? And that's going to change partially because the CO2 footprint of that lithium molecule from the point it's mined to the point it ends up in the battery is way too high if we're going to have millions of these electric vehicles on the roads in the next few years. And so that's one of the reasons why you are seeing a rebuild of these supply chains.
So I just want to stop, so for people to understand, we're talking about the electrification of transport, electric vehicles. What kind of penetration do electrification vehicles have today? What's the percentage? I thought it was like 3.5% globally.
Yeah, that's right.
It's a very small number, and yet General Motors came out and said they will not be producing any more conventional cars by, I think, 2035, if I'm not mistaken. Yep. So this is a huge shift. How are we going to go from a 3.5% penetration, and how are the companies gearing up? I mean, it's an astonishing number that you said right now about how much lithium use is going to go up. But you know, let's talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So your I guess your estimate is absolutely right. Last year in 2020, electric vehicles, and when you talk about electric vehicles, that's, you know, full battery electric vehicles, it's hybrids, it's everything, was around 3.5% of the global fleet. Okay. My view, again, if lithium is going to be at 1 million tons of demand by 2026, that would give us around a 10% electric vehicle penetration rate. And again, we are jumping around a little bit here. Let me just, we can take a look at some of these later, but you know, the question I get a lot from clients of mine or the media is, well, what exactly does that mean in terms of overall demand for these materials, okay? And this is an exercise, to be clear, that has a number of assumptions that you have to make. So you have to think about, well, how far in the future are we talking about? What is my EV penetration rate? What's the size of the overall automotive market? And as you can see here, what's the battery size and what's the chemistry? And we don't necessarily need to go down this rabbit hole of different chemistries today. But, you know, let's assume that we jump to 2026 and we're at a 10% EV penetration rate. So I'm assuming that that's 10 million electric vehicles sold in that specific year with a battery size of 50 kilowatt hours and a specific nickel, manganese, cobalt chemistry that I think will be dominant by then. What you do, these are just sort of rules of thumb in terms of how much lithium and cobalt and nickel are utilized in that chemistry. And so this tells you that, okay, so by 2026, to have a 10% EV penetration rate, we will need 400,000 tons of battery grade lithium. Okay, and I would remind everybody on the call today that the entire global lithium market, and that's spread across other end uses like ceramics and pharmaceuticals, not just batteries, the entire market today is 350,000 tons. Okay, so there are a couple of issues that arise here. Number one, obviously the environmental challenges. How do we produce, you know, triple the amount sustainably? And then look, from the financial perspective, the capital markets want to make sure that they can generate an adequate return. So to triple lithium production in the next 5 years, you're going to require around $10 to $12 billion in capital. And a new lithium mine, in terms of bringing it on stream and developing it, can take anywhere from 5 to 7 years. So this is where you get dislocations in the market and price spikes, and the geopolitical aspects really come into play. And, you know, it does raise the issue of resource nationalism. And I kind of want to turn the tables a little bit, Sophia, maybe ask you, you know, in your research with respect to rare earths or these critical materials, I mean, do you come across these challenges with resource nationalism a lot? I mean, is this an issue you think you're going to see more of?
Well, I'm really glad that you're asking that question, because I think what's happening is countries now have options. And part of what we're seeing is that these resources are located in the developing world. And for a very long time, I would say that, especially, you know, after the end of the Cold War, it seemed as if the triumphant West had almost neglected, I would say, the needs and aspirations of the developing world. And China kind of came in the interim to say that, you know what, we're going to grow, but we're also going to bring you on board, which is why countries started having options in terms of financing. They could now not necessarily have to rely on Western aid that came with the caveats of more democracy or, you know, education for women. It came like attached with norms and values because citizens and governments were championing these values. And suddenly China came in with convening power and financial clout and offered another vision, which is, we don't get involved in your domestic affairs. We want to do business. It's all win-win. Let's cooperate. So China has been able, especially even before the Belt and Road, it's just that the Belt and Road Initiative gave it sort of, it gave it a title, it formalized this vision to create inroads in many countries of the developing world in which we have these resources. So the question that's now happened with realizing the vulnerability and how fraught relations are is, what is going to be the position of the United States and Europe? Are they going to go back to, I mean, Europe has maintained closer relations with the developing world, even in the past, but it's being outcompeted by China in terms of how much attention and resources that they can devote. And also their countries are not willing to take the kinds of financial risks that state-backed companies from China are willing to take, or even private companies from China are willing to take, because they feel the risk is mitigated from help from government. But this is going to be the big question about how are we going to work with countries in the developing world in order to have access to these resources, frankly, especially since everyone is trying to crowd out this, or dominate, I would say, the space of the new industrial policy, which is the energy transition and the decarbonization, especially of transport, which has a huge ecological footprint.
Yeah.
Footprint.
And I just want to bounce back here. Whoops. Sorry, guys. We'll jump around here. But, you know, to your point, this is, if we're talking about lithium-ion batteries, this is where we are today. Okay. And this is data from Benchmark Mineral Intelligence, but it does, I think, speak to a lot of what you had just mentioned, where whether or not you look at just the mining or the refining or any aspect of this battery supply chain, clearly China, and this is not, you know, overnight. China has really moved to dominate these next generation industries. I find it interesting that, you know, if you just look at rare earth for a second, I mean, magnet separation or magnet manufacturing, excuse me, the separation and the manufacturing is not a state secret. You know, this isn't something that only the Chinese know how to do. There is magnet manufacturing in countries outside of China, and there's even rare earth separation in countries outside of China, but we have not yet put it all together. And the critical aspect, I would argue, is the raw material supply, at least specifically with respect to rare earths. Obviously, there are a couple of looming plays here in the United States. MP Material has just, of course, tried to resuscitate Mountain Pass. And so it is a race, to your point earlier, but it sort of remains to be seen, I would argue, how we sort of wrest control away from China and kind of balance the table a little bit, because clearly this decarbonization theme, look, quite frankly, it's going to be very, very lucrative if you can find those aspects across the supply chain where you can compete. And the challenge is, I would argue, we haven't been able to compete successfully with the Chinese, and this is the predictable result.
So I think there's this realization, the awakening, something that's been there all the time. And I know that over the years, you and I have been talking about this, and you always say that when the prices are high, everybody's interested in how to get these resources. And then when the prices are low, everybody moves on to the next best thing. Which brings me to a really important point. And I think that this added value that you bring to the table. I know that for years you've been trying to bridge this kind of, bring all these different parties into conversation, which is, politics, the defense industry, because these materials are really important for the defense industry as well. Also the financial community, the tech people, even just the industry itself. Why is it that it seems like everybody's talking about this, but nobody seems to be really communicating? Because this is a big picture theme. Are politics enough? Are politics enough to trump economics? Can the will of the government, can the government mandate that all the supply chains return home, whatever home that is? Is that even realistic or desirable in the end?
Yeah, I think, you're spelling out the Chinese model where politics does trump economics, generally speaking, because it's all about social stability there more than anything else, and an increasing sort of quality of life for the average citizen. And so, right sizing, for example, production capacity has never necessarily been the area of focus in the way that it would here in the West, where we've got Adam Smith's invisible hand, and to your point earlier, pricing and economics, I would argue, really do dictate everything. I mean, it's been encouraging to see here in the United States, the Department of Defense offer assistance, I guess I would call it, for companies like Lynas on the rare earth side to build a refinery here in the United States. And
well, finally, it took them a good 11 years to do that.
It did. We could have been having a very similar conversation, Sophia, in 2011 or 2012. We probably were. And a lot of the senators and congressmen and congresswomen who are supporting this legislation, supporting this push to regionalize supply chains here in the United States, or maybe across borders with Canada, they were saying the same things in 2011 and 2012. And I think one of the reasons why I hate to say this because you should never say this phrase in investing, it's different this time. Maybe one of the things that is potentially different is, there is a very powerful tailwind here with respect to these critical materials, and it has to do with technology and cost deflation. In particular, with respect to batteries, it's not a Moore's law type of thing, but we have seen battery pricing fall, partially because of scale, partially because of technology, by about 90% in the last 10 years. And so, this idea, a few years ago where an electric vehicle was nowhere near economic on a total cost of ownership basis with an internal combustion engine car, that is going to change. And that is probably, I would predict, going to change by as soon as 2024, 2023 or 2024. And that's why you're starting to see more legislation be put in place. And I think you're starting to see more money, more government money come into these supply chains, because the economics are now actually pretty favorable, very favorable. And again, there's also the competition with respect to China and other parts of the world as well. So it really, at the end of the day, I would argue it is an economic decision more than anything else. I mean, when I speak with financiers, they understand convertible bonds and they understand rates of return, but they don't understand dendrites in batteries, right? Or they don't understand, flow sheets. I'm just making this up. And it's the same thing, when you go and you talk to a geologist, they understand mining, but they don't know what the financial aspects or the repercussions are here. And so the challenge that we have in the West, I would argue, is tying those disparate groups, the academia, the actual companies themselves, the technologists, together, and sort of bridging the gaps between their knowledge gaps and putting the supply chain together. But it really, I think, does start with this acceptance from the government level that, hey, we have an opportunity and a challenge here.
Right. But, there are conventional interests. I mean, Europe has always been much more willing to make this transition to carbon neutrality. I mean, it's been, for all the criticism of the European Union about what they do and what they don't do right, the reality is that the European Union had particular targets. It was also, very clear about what it wanted to achieve in reduction of carbon emissions. And it started even earlier with the European Battery Alliance to try, especially after the VW fiasco, where they decided that, perhaps diesel cars are not the future. They decided to kind of move into this new sphere and in this new technological transition. But in America, it seems like, yes, the winds are very favorable, but I'm already hearing that the fossil fuel industry is pushing back. It's pushing back in more ways than one, because it knows that it has to push back right now.
Yeah.
And the politics could change in 2 years in Washington. How could that affect, is there enough steam now that really you can turn back the clock? Will a delay be a problem? Because, I understand that in terms of like finances and production, it's really important to, companies are interested in succeeding in this undertaking, but we also have this threat of climate change on our backs, which is the biggest threat that the planet is facing. So do you think that we're going to really maintain this momentum? Who are the actors who will maintain a greater momentum, do you think, in this transition?
I think right now, I mean, I hate to say this as an American, but it's a two-horse race. And the two-horse race is China and the European Union, for all of the reasons, all of the data that you had just laid out. I mean, it never ceases to amaze me, back when we could go to conferences in person, you'd be a rare earth conference or a lithium conference or whatever, I'd get up there on the stage and I'd just take a very informal poll and say, okay, who in this room owns an electric vehicle? And I don't know, 100 people in the audience, maybe 1 or 2 people raised their hands. And that shocked me, because it kind of does match up actually with EV penetration. But nevertheless, it shocked me because, this is a captive audience. The people in this room actually care about this stuff. And yet there's just a real lack of awareness of how transformative electrification can be. And quite honestly, I think how relatively seamless it could be. The oil and gas business, I mean, obviously last year with COVID was hopefully an anomaly, but the oil and gas business wrote off over $150 billion in assets last year, which is an enormous sum for assets that were economic at a specific price point, and of course now are not. And so the question, I would argue the existential question that the oil and gas business is facing is, how do we generate returns in this environment where, to your point earlier, this whole energy transition is slowly taking place, eating into their margins and eating into their business. And you have seen companies like, for example, Total, move pretty aggressively into renewables and try and reinvent themselves to a certain degree. But, it's not happening fast enough. I would just say one other thing, from the standpoint of statistics. If you go back to April of 2020, kind of at the height of the first wave of COVID, oil prices, I can't remember if it was March, might have been early April, but oil prices went negative.
Oh, of course.
About 20 million barrels of oil per day went off the market, just not used because everything was shut down. I mean, the global economy, even with a shutdown, still used around 70 million barrels of oil a day. Okay. And, even if we jump to 2026 and we're at a 10% EV penetration rate, we're still at a 90% internal combustion engine penetration rate. And so I'm not trying to rain on the parade of electrification, because it is happening. It is going to grow very, very strongly out over the next decade. But, the oil and gas business, I would argue, is not going anywhere anytime soon, but does really need to think hard about how they can continue to generate returns to compete with these new energy producers and providers.
You've got me thinking that what we need to really clarify is that even what we're trying to achieve now with all these plans to go carbon neutral, we really should understand what it means to be carbon neutral anyway. It means basically that, we're not going to be we're going to come to the point where what we put and what we take out it reaches some kind of equilibrium, right? So we don't want to keep adding carbon, and we're going to be making this transition, which is why I started by saying that, the electrification of transport and the energy transition is not the only item on the table, but it seems like it's taking up a lot of our focus because it's the place where we're seeing potential for economic growth. After we're experiencing one of the most serious global economic recessions or contractions, we can call it, since World War II, right? So it doesn't seem as if, one of the things that I guess I want to go to right now and talk a little bit about is the fact that, we're looking at this as a panacea, that this will make or break our response, let's say, to climate change. But even, we've been talking about these materials. Let's talk about the materials themselves. I mean, it seems like we're going to need a lot of them. We're going to need to mine a lot of them. What are some of the implications around that? The mining industry has sort of been, I don't want to say it's been forgotten, because time and again, both the media and many scholars have been working on the mining industry in particular countries in the developing world. But for the most part, people in OECD countries, mining was sort of out of sight, out of mind.
Right.
I venture to say.
Yeah.
But mining, you can't hide anymore. What about the mining industry?
Yeah, well, like I said, this is my fundamental thesis is here, the paradox of decarbonization, however you want to phrase it. We're going to need a lot more of these materials. And I actually do a great deal of work in the lithium-ion battery recycling business, which up until recently, and this is going to make a very broad statement, but the economics, again, I hate to come back to the economics, but they have been they just haven't really worked, okay? But now that you're looking at a situation where, gigafactory scale plants are being built all over the world, we're at around, I would say, maybe 250 gigawatt hours of plant capacity globally today. That's probably on the low end, going to roughly 2 terawatt hours by 2030 and more if you talk to Tesla. Clearly recycling, not just of the spent batteries, but of the scrap is going to be very, very important. But it is not enough, I would argue, to bridge the gap that I talked about earlier, where demand for some of these resources is going to triple. And so I think, countries that focus on R&D, for example, around recycling or around more efficient use of these materials are going to be the real winners. The ESG push that you're starting to see, look, to be honest, every mining PowerPoint or pitch deck has a slide on ESG, and they should.
I was on a call recently where I heard a lithium company in Brazil talk about how much they're doing in this. You would think that there's absolutely no repercussions, environmental or social repercussions, and yet many scholars have written about that. So I know there's a preoccupation that they bring to the table. They feel like they need to bring data, and they also need to discuss best practices and benchmark themselves.
And you're starting to see situations where banks will actually fund projects that can adhere to relatively strict ESG criteria. And so that's very important. And, also you've got situations where Elon Musk came out on an earnings call and said, look, we'll write a very, very large check to anybody that can produce nickel sustainably and at scale. And that's an enormous challenge, quite frankly, because let's face it, mining is a really chemically complicated, dare I say, dirty business. And but it really is at the fundamental kind of root of everything we're talking about today. So, no easy solutions. We're going to need a lot more of these materials. Recycling, I predict recycling is going to become much more important, much faster than people think, but it's not going to be enough.
Right. And why is it that recycling is so difficult? I mean, we talked about that even in the case of rare earths. I mean, there are two things that really bother me in the rare earths case. Rare earths case is every time there's a conversation about that there's going to be a rare earths crunch, or that we're going to need all these materials and we really can't source them anywhere except China. Articles come out a day later and tell us about how, they're in Greenland, they're in Afghanistan, they're in the ocean, they're on the moon, and that we need to go mine the moon, and that never fear, rare earths are all over and we're going to have access to them. But the reality is that, in the 10 years since the rare earth crisis of 2010, when China, for different reasons, had halved, it had an unofficial embargo of rare earths to Japan, and then it also cut the export quota by half, shocking the world.
Mhm.
It had a 97% control. Now it's around 80, but still, it still maintains, as you said, the entire supply chain. So even if you're producing rare earths in Mountain Pass, California, they're being refined, they're being processed in China, and then they come back. So this I kind of lost my train of thought where I was going with it. But all by way of saying, we need all of these, we're going to need a lot of these materials. They have a very important environmental footprint, and we haven't been able to recycle them. Why? Is it a technical issue? Is it a question of cost? Is it a question of quantity in the various applications?
All of the above. I hate to throw, punt that one a little bit, but just on the battery side, okay, you have different battery chemistries. You have lithium iron phosphate, you have nickel manganese cobalt, and even within nickel manganese cobalt, you have different weights of those metals in the battery. You have nickel, cobalt, aluminum. First of all, a battery is kind of like it's a chemical reaction in a box, for lack of a better phrase. It's very volatile and dangerous. Lithium in particular, of course, when you get it wet or expose it to oxygen, it can explode. So it's very unstable. It has really, people like the recycling angle for batteries is really driven by, to date, has been driven by cobalt pricing and nickel pricing predominantly. So that's why you've seen the majority of batteries that have been recycled are lithium cobalt oxide in nature, and that would be the type of battery found in your phone. But again, there is an enormous amount of R&D going into this, I guess, sector in Canada. A company that I'm involved with is really working hard on it. China, again, just from a sheer capacity perspective, is really moving aggressively to leverage some of the technology that they've put together around this. So again, it's a matter of time. I mean, the challenge has been, you've got all these different battery chemistries, or on the rare earth side, you've got, quite frankly, very small magnets. And so you need a lot of these to make the whole process economic. In addition to that, because you have different chemistries, different cell formats, different magnet sizes, it's not a one size fits all type of, or hasn't to date been a one size fits all type of process. And that's really meant it's been higher cost. And, without lithium at $20,000 or cobalt at, I don't know, $100,000, or dysprosium at $2,000 a kilogram, it hasn't made economic sense. But the good news is that's starting to change.
Okay, so right now we keep talking about making economic sense, and we know that when you have a dominant position, you can also, let's say, help move the dial on the pricing side. Mm-hmm. So if these minerals, I mean, what is the price trajectory at the moment? Are they starting to change upwards? And what would happen with all of these efforts, for example, by the United States, by Europe, to decouple from China? Could they stall? How would it, how will they be impacted? I mean, has everybody decided to to commit to higher prices if it means to bring the supply chains at home?
I would say people have not, verbally committed to that. Let me just jump on a couple of screens here to show you and the audience what is happening from a pricing perspective. First, we'll just take a quick look at lithium, and then we can look at one of the rare earths. And so, this rather ugly looking chart is the price of battery grade lithium carbonate per ton going back to 2014. You can kind of see nothing happened, and then if we come back here, gigafactories are getting announced. The Chinese want to have, I think, 20% of EV sales by 2025, or 20% of automotive sales be EV by 2025. It's been a very painful, sort of slow hangover for those of us that are bullish in the space, and things are starting to turn. Okay, and things are starting to turn partially because of everything we've discussed up today. Legislation in the Eurozone, here in the United States, in China, and quite frankly, an issue of oversupply in the business, in the lithium business, being mopped up. Now, for the investors on the call, this is obviously a bullish sign, because this is the price of lithium, battery grade lithium carbonate in China. What you see here typically happens in the rest of the world 6 to 9 months later. Okay, so it is kind of a forward-looking indicator. I think that the incentive price, in other words, the price to bring brand new lithium supply on stream to feed this demand, is going to be around $11,000 per ton. Okay, and that's US dollars. Where are we today? Well, for carbonate, again, there's no specific lithium price, but we're at about $8,500 a ton. So there is room to sort of grow here, room to run. And I would show you one other slide here, which is interesting. This is neodymium. This is data off of Bloomberg, so it's kind of their pricing and their view. Some people may agree with it, but nevertheless, the trajectory here is what's important. For those of you on the Zoom today that aren't aware, neodymium is critical for magnets in electric vehicle motors. Okay, so again, you come back to that slide that I talked about earlier, where you need roughly 1 kilogram of various rare earth elements per EV, and again, that varies based on the size, but nevertheless, you start doing the math, and with rare earths at, say, 175,000 tons a year in size, spread across 15 different rare earths, you can see how the pricing pressure that we're seeing here makes total sense with EVs taking off. And so, again, this is really a geopolitical football, but the Chinese have a saying, and this goes way back, but it's to the rest of the world: don't say we didn't warn you. Okay, and so some of the challenges and this price spikes that we saw in 2012, when the Chinese cut off rare earth exports to the world, I'm not here to predict that they will happen again. I would argue they hopefully won't. But nevertheless, this is what you get from a pricing perspective when demand takes off, politicians start to pay attention, and the supply chains aren't, quite frankly, built out. I mean, the question I get a lot is, well, how long would it take to build a fully self-sufficient supply chain for rare earths in the United States or in the Eurozone? And I would say the best case scenario would be 7 years. Okay.
Oh, wow. So you know what? I'm loving the conversation, because it just really brings to life that we can have somebody talking stats and finances and timelines, because sometimes we tend to talk about this dealing with climate change or the energy transition in more abstract or normative, I would say, terms. What we need to do, we need more multilateralism, we need to rally, we need to collaborate. But when it's, when you get down to it, this part that now that we're, I think, showcasing or shining a light on is that, it has to make business sense. It has to, we need to factor in different aspects like the science, the resources themselves, the supply chains, the geopolitics, how things move around, technological innovation. So I know we have some interesting questions, And Chris, I'm going to look at the chat box right now. So one question is, are critical minerals essential for every aspect of the planet's sustainable development portfolio, or is its relevance specific to EVs? What else are they important for? I know we focus a lot on EVs as if it's the beginning and end of the transition, but there is solar, there is wind, there are other technologies out there. But the focus has been on EVs because that is the major push right now.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit more about that, Chris. What are your thoughts on that?
I think people tend to focus on transportation because it's, I think if I remember the stats correctly, it's 20 to 25% of CO2 emissions. And so if you can electrify transport, whether or not it's with fleets or individual, mobility or what have you, you really do take a big chunk out of I guess, of CO2 emissions here. So the challenge is that, yes, we've talked about lithium, we've talked about cobalt, we talked about rare earths. I mean, these metals and minerals, in some cases are absolutely essential. For example, like lithium in the lithium-ion battery is essential, right? There is no substitute. Fortunately, it's abundant in the Earth's crust. It's not all focused in China. So it's critical in the sense that we need it for the battery business. It's not critical in the sense that one country dominates the production. But substitution is I'll call it a threat, for certain elements. For example, you can make motors that go into go into magnet. You can make magnets that go into motors that do not use dysprosium, for example. Are they less efficient? Yes. Are they, maybe perhaps slightly more expensive? It remains to be seen. That depends on the price of dysprosium. If you go back again to 2012, when the price of dysprosium went from around $200 a kilogram to $2,000 a kilogram, literally every magnet scientist that worked for an OEM or was involved in the space at all went to work to say, how do we minimize, the use of these critical materials in these next generation technologies? And for the most part, while you can minimize the use of one critical material, you end up compensating for that by using more of something else. Okay.
So substitution or, reconfiguring, I guess I would say the recipe, if we were in a kitchen, on how things work is possible, but we can't really, at the moment, we're not innovating out of using some of these vital critical minerals. But I just want to also say, for those who asked, that, rare earths, I think by saying magnets, we need to explain that magnets are used in anything from a missile guided system to, the iPhone, to the computers that we use. We've been using a lot of rare earths. We've been using rare earths in lighting. Now this is changing a little bit with LED technology, but there's so many aspects and there's so many applications, high-tech applications in which we use a lot of these critical materials. Lithium and cobalt is basically for the batteries, but rare earths are used very widely from
sure, infrared missile guidance. There's all kinds of stuff. Absolutely.
Yes. So one other question that I say, I can't even speak to that, but can hydrogen fuel cells be an alternative to lithium-ion batteries in EVs? I don't know how to answer that.
Yeah, I haven't spent as much time in the hydrogen space as I have with batteries. And I think, again, it boils down to an economic argument. My understanding is that even for, again, I hate to use automotive as the example, but could be forklifts, could be automotive, could be buses, you still need a lithium-ion battery in that machine. Okay, so the idea, I think, that you're just going to have hydrogen fuel cells and they are going to be self-sufficient without battery backup. My understanding, and again, I'm not an expert here, but my understanding is that you're still going to need lithium-ion coupled with this hydrogen fuel cell technology. I think right now The challenge with hydrogen and hydrogen fuel cells is the fact that there's no widespread and economic fueling network. Again, that could change in the coming years, to be sure, but I mean, one of the smartest things Tesla ever did before they started selling, hundreds of thousands of cars was they built out their supercharger network, and they continue to do that. And that is one of the biggest reasons, I think, why EVs in particular are going to proliferate. It's because there is a charging network out there. And, Tesla really led the way in this one.
So this is a really important issue, because what we're describing is what makes this whole decarbonization of the economy process so important is that we're really going to revolutionize all infrastructure, because we can't have electric vehicles without places in which we can recharge them. I currently will go to the supermarket, and there are two places where you park where you can plug in your car. That's going to have to happen on every block. That's going to have to happen so much more widely. And also, I mean, again, this idea of changing, not only changing the infrastructure, but being able to bring to the table, one of the things that I know that you've talked about a lot is how we need to have a new conversation with stakeholders. What is this kind of conversation? Who do you envision as stakeholders? Because mining is going to be a very big part of it. Do you think there'll be more mining in the United States, for example, itself? I mean, we have the developing world where, my idea is that the OECD countries now need to really have a new proposition for the developing world to respond to the aspirations and their dreams and their goals of being able to provide for their own citizens, to develop their economies in a sustainable fashion. Given the situation, they are the most vulnerable to the climate crisis. But there's also going to be conversations about mining, especially in the United States. So, because there are some of these resources exist in the United States, who needs to be part of this conversation?
Sure. I mean, obviously the mining companies themselves, the mining industry, the environmentalists, the local and federal government, and of course the local citizens, the local populations are all going to have to come to the table and realize that if we are serious about self-sufficiency, job creation, increasing the tax base, trying to put the scenario together where everybody wins, we're all going to have to give something up. Okay. In the case of the mining business, if we are going to adhere to more strict ESG standards, and we absolutely should, that could mean higher cost, which could affect economics, which could mean, your cost to borrow funds to build out a project could be higher than it would normally be. And look, I mean, that's just a challenge. People tend to look at these feasibility studies and just look, okay, what's the IRR? What's the NPV? Is this thing going to work? Great, let's go for it or not. And so, you're always trying to wring out the costs. The government is obviously going to be focused on balancing environmental stewardship and increasing the tax base. So, and look, they may not necessarily get everything they want. I mean, it's a very complicated question in terms of not so much who's at the table, but how much people are willing to give up to get this done.
So there are two things. I mean, I guess what you're pointing out to is that stakeholder engagement is going to be necessary. But one other thing that I keep hearing, and I would like to push a little on this issue, is, are we actually really saying that we need to decouple from China? I mean, is that even a thing? All the Asian countries signed globalization is under threat, we keep saying. We're talking about retrenchment or renationalization, but is it really true? I mean, a huge trade deal was signed between Europe and China recently, and also between countries in Asia. I mean, after the United States left, the Asian trade deal, Asia-Pacific trade deal, the Chinese had the opportunity to reactivate their own version. And this was just signed and agreed upon in the late fall of 2020. So we keep talking about globalization being under threat, about this need to decouple from China or decouple from each other. And China is saying, this makes no sense. You know, I'm the second largest economy, if not the largest pretty soon. Mm-hmm. Is this even possible? And it doesn't look as if other countries have the appetite. I mean, do we really need to speak in these black and white terms? Can we have some kind of hybrid, since we're moving into a more hybrid system anyway? Can we have more of a hybrid system? Can we take some of the geopolitics out of this question of supply chains, since we're going to need more cooperation anyway in order to deal with the climate crisis more widely?
Yeah, I think, well, I mean, COVID highlighted the vulnerability around these supply chains, whether or not it's with, you know, medical equipment or, of course, critical materials, which is something, again, we've been talking about for years. I would think that this idea of decoupling, complete decoupling, is just unrealistic. I mean, I just don't know how you would do that and sort of foment economic growth. I mean, I think that it does make sense to look at specific aspects of the economy. Again, what we're talking about today, critical materials, and going that way to decouple. Sure, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, again, at the end of the day, when we talk about decarbonization and climate change, consumers are going to want to know, they're going to want to have an audit trail for every piece of material in their car. Where did it come from? How is it produced? What does end of life look like? And I would argue that when you have a more regionalized supply chain structure that is easier to track, it's easier to let your customer know, hey, this is where it came from and this is where it goes at the end of life. But I wouldn't think that, you know, decoupling, supposing you could even do it without wrecking the global economy, it just wouldn't be optimal for anybody involved. But I do see supply chains getting tighter because of this need for an audit trail around ESG and around CO2 emissions.
So that's a really interesting point. We haven't even touched upon, we're going to have to start wrapping up now. I want to thank you so much for participating in this conversation, and really I want to thank the audience for their excellent questions. One thing I want to address before we leave is that it seems like people are asking, it doesn't seem like we're talking about a lot of this in climate negotiations. I don't know what your thoughts are. Do you think this is an area that needs to be highlighted more when we're talking about the climate more generally? Do you think it should take, because it seems as if people don't understand, people don't know or haven't been exposed to this kind of, to the complexity of
right.
what it means to really decarbonize the economy.
Most of the supply chains have been in Asia. They've been very economic and the economy has grown and no one's really worried about this stuff. And now it's much different with the focus on the climate. So again, I really think that the eyeballs are going to be on this space. You know, again, one last thing about, you know, why no one talks about mining. It's because, you know, lithium, for example, lithium demand has grown at about, I don't know, 5 or 6% per year for the last 10 years. And now through 2025, I'm thoroughly convinced lithium demand is going to grow by 20% a year. So that's an enormous shock to this system. With rare earths, I mean, I could see a situation where it grows 10 to 12% a year out of the next 5 years at least. So, you know, it hasn't been talked about very much, but it's going to continue to be talked about because of the demand shock that we're just in the first innings of seeing.
Okay, well, again, Chris, thank you so much. I hope this has been an interesting webinar for
Great.
all of you who attended. Thank you for being with us. I want to thank NYU Abu Dhabi for and the Earth Humanities, the Global Asia Initiative at NYU Abu Dhabi, the Rachel Carson Center of LMU Munich, and I'd also like to point out that we're going to have more conversations about what all of these green deals mean. So please stay tuned. I'd like to thank our team for the Earth Humanities and NYU Abu Dhabi for helping put this together. And also to say that I've been a fellow at Caltech in the Huntington, and we're going to be hosting a conference later in the summer to talk about bringing in different experts, scholars, and industry and institutions, international institutions, to talk more about this kind of a transition and what the critical minerals mean, the importance of critical minerals is in this transition. And we haven't even begun to touch upon the fourth industrial revolution and the digitalization of the global economy, which is another aspect that impacts our use of critical minerals and the geopolitics. So stay tuned for more information on this space. Thank you very, very much for joining us. Have a wonderful evening or a great day wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you.